5080 is a joke. अरे हाँ ये वीडियो आई हुई है देखो. Nvidia, this is a joke. RTX 5080, right?
The new RTX
Let's see. Let's watch the video.
5080 is launching tomorrow. So let's take a look at how fast this thing really
Tomorrow.
is.
And when is tomorrow इनका? अच्छा आज ही वीडियो आई है क्या? तो टुमारो का मतलब हो गया आज क्या है 30th को आ रही है. ओके 30th को आ रहा है.
Taking a look at the 5090 and that definitely set the tone for what to expect. I mean, this generation is not looking like a massive jump at all, especially in terms of the performance versus power curve. It's maybe the smallest jump we've seen in the last decade. As for the 5080, it's a $1,000 GPU, $200 less than the 4080, but the same price as the 4080 Super, which launched a little bit later on. For that, you get slightly more shaders, slightly smaller silicon process, same VRAM capacity at 16 gigabytes, although it is higher bandwidth at GDDR7. As a little refresher, let's go back to the 3080 and the 4080 and see what kind of gains we were getting there. In the 12 games that I tested, there was quite a bit of variance, anywhere from 96% down to 10%. But on average, the 4080 was a 36% generational leap. As for the new 5080, that number is now 14%. In fact, it's 6%.
बस What the fuck, bro? 14%. क्या हो गया है भाई गेमिंग को? क्या हो गया ग्राफिक कार्ड्स को?
In Stalker 2, 5% in Black Ops 6, and just 4% in Cyberpunk. At most, I saw a 23% uplift in F124.
यही मैं बोल रहा था. जो लोग मेरे से बोल रहे थे ना कि सिखपाजी आप क्या नया ग्राफिक कार्ड लोगे, सिखपाजी क्या आप क्या 5080 लूं मैं ना लूं ये लूं, मैंने इसीलिए बोला था भाई एक बार रिव्यूज आ जाने दो फिर पता चलेगा कि भाई लेना चाहिए कि नहीं लेना चाहिए. अब जाके पता चल रहा है ना, खुलासा हो रहा है भाई. 14%. इससे अच्छा 4080 आपको सस्ते में मिल जाए, अब वो उठा लो भाई. अगर 1 लाख का 5080 है, 1 लाख नहीं 1.25 लाख का मान लो 5080 है, 1.25 लाख का, और अगर आपको 4080 सुपर तो अगर 80,000 में मिल रहा है, बेस्ट डील हुई भाई. Shit.
4 and 21% in the new God of War. If you thought these gains were bad, let's swap out the 4080 for the 4080 Super. After all, the 5080 is $1,000. The 4080 Super was $1,000. The average improvement now drops to just 9%.
9% के लिए उन्होंने ग्राफिक कार्ड नया निकाल दिया.
Identical, which just blows my mind. I have no idea how nvidia thought this was okay. One good thing, I guess, is that the new 5080 is actually pretty low power in comparison to these other cards. The listed TDP has gone up to 360 watts, but it actually pulls way lower than that. On average, I was seeing 273 watts. In most cases, this would be a good thing, but here, it actually just makes the 5080 look weak. I would much rather this be a full 300
जो मैंने बोला, exactly जो मैंने बोला.
4080 Super and at least see a bit more performance. The benefit of it being a lower power GPU though does mean some pretty good temperatures. This Founders Edition uses the exact same cooler from the 5090 as far as I can see. After 30 minutes at full load, it was topping out at just 65 degrees on an open bench. And that was with higher than average power draw and a pretty warm room temperature of 25 degrees C. So some of the aftermarket mammoth triple slot cards I'd imagine will easily sit in the low 60s with this thing, even being in a closed case. It's funny actually, my VR racing sim behind me has a 4080 in it, and I was genuinely planning to upgrade that to the new 5080, but as you can now see, that would be completely pointless. If you're coming from something like a 3080 or under though, it would be a meaningful upgrade. I mean, you're definitely getting some more frames. Between a 3080 and a 5080, it's like 70% uplift on average.
Oh, तो अगर मेरे पास 3080 है, चलो 3080 Ti है, not 3080. 3080 Ti को अगर मैं 5080 से रिप्लेस करता हूँ, तो 70 नहीं तो मैं 65%, 60% तो मैं मान के चलता हूँ मेरे को परफॉर्मेंस इंप्रूवमेंट मिलेगा. 60% इज ह्यूज. मतलब अगर मेरे को 100 FPS किसी गेम में आ रही है तो मेरे को भाई आएगी 160, 170, which is crazy good, right? 4080 सुपर भी ले सकते हो आप ऑब्वियसली, क्योंकि 5080 इज इक्वल टू 4080 सुपर. मेरा तो 2060 सुपर है, तो आपके लिए तो ये अपग्रेड विल बी लाइफ चेंजिंग. 100% से भी ज्यादा परफॉर्मेंस इंप्रूवमेंट. 100%, 150% ऐसा हो जाएगा. 4080 is cheaper, yeah.
In some games, you'll see over double the performance while seeing less power draw as well. Black Ops 6 is a bit of a weird one there. I did retest that as well today. Even on the 4080 though, it does seem to underperform for some reason. And for those wondering, 5080 versus 5090, it's a $1,000 difference in MSRP, probably even more than that in the real world. And we're looking at a 50% jump in frame rate on average. But yeah, 5080 man, it is pretty disappointing. For a bit more context, the past 80 tier GPUs like the 3080 and the 4080, they were faster than the flagships of the previous generation. So 3080 versus 2080 Ti, 4080 versus 3090, they cleared them pretty easily. This new 5080 though has no chance of beating a 4090. Even if you go back as far as the 2080, the 1080, the GTX 980, they were all faster than the previous flagships. Here though, I mean, this thing is looking more like a 5070. Quick mention on DLSS 4 multi-frame gen, it's the new exclusive feature on these GPUs, and it is very polarizing to say the least. I've seen some completely
frame gen 2x 5090, 127, 180 and 228. Who would even require 5090? Like games तो आ नहीं रहे 5090 वाले. जिनको 4K पे गेमिंग करनी है वो भी अच्छे FPS पे. Literally it's the only use case which I can think of. अगर आपको 4K के नीचे गेमिंग करनी ही नहीं है तो 5090 makes a very solid choice.
90 review, and actually I had a better than expected experience. The additional smoothness gained for me far outweighed the visual artifacting that I was seeing most of the time. Being able to go from 80 frames per second up to 240, 250 frames per second is something that I would look forward to switching on in some games. But then when I went to use it on the 5080 with the exact same settings, my experience was far worse, and that's because the starting frame rate was much lower. Instead of the starting frame rate being like 75, 80 frames per second on the 5090, it was more like 50, 55 FPS on the 5080. And since the frame rate is lower, that means the time delay between frames is greater, which means more visual artifacting, and it also means greater latency. So yeah, if your starting frame rate is like 50, 40, maybe even 30 FPS, I think that's going to be pretty unbearable. But if you give it an input frame rate of like 80-ish FPS, being able to boost up to that 250, 260 FPS range with frame gen, you can now fully saturate a 4K 240Hz monitor. Yeah, that is a nice little bonus feature. It is never something that I would recommend for competitive games though, let's be totally clear about that. I feel like that just goes without saying. I know the frame rates look super enticing, but the frames are delayed most importantly, and introducing any chance of like artifacting or ghosting is just plainly a bad idea in that style of game. In those games, just set everything to the absolute lowest settings, and if you need more frames after that, you can drop your render resolution as well. For single player games though, where I want to load up the graphics, maybe kick back with a controller and just enjoy the story, yeah, I don't find frame gen that offensive. Just make sure that you're feeding it an input frame rate, at least above 60 frames per second. I know Nvidia's marketing around it has also been super aggressive, which is not the best, but now the truth is out there, so we can all see it for what it is. So if a 4080 Super and a 5080 are sitting on the shelf at the exact same price, of course, you'll go with the 5080, but what's more likely to happen in the real world is that the 4080 Super is going to be a little bit cheaper, or maybe you'll be able to find a used 4090 for a little bit more. And
oh हाँ भाई, ये ऑप्शन तो क्या क्रेजी हो गया ना कि instead of buying a 5080 I can get a 4090 second hand या 4090 at a cheaper price, क्योंकि वो जब आया था $1500 का था. अब $1500 घट के $1200 अगर मान लो हो गया है, मान लो, और $1200 का आपको, चलो $1000 का मान लो आपको ये पड़ रहा है 5080, बट वो $200 डाल के आपको क्रेजी परफॉर्मेंस मिल रही है ब्रो. $200 इज इक्वल टू 20,000. 20,000 में आप 5080 से अच्छी परफॉर्मेंस मिल रही है मतलब आप तो 4090 तो लाइक एक्चुअल गोटेड चॉइस हो जाएगी अब. इफ एनीबडी इज ट्राइंग टू go for a 5080, it's better go for a 4090.
I would prefer to go with those other two options instead. So yeah, definitely not a GPU that you'll just want to throw your money at. Definitely consider your other options.